Welcome to Wine Country at Work with Ralph and Lonnie de Amicis.
We're here in the southeast corner of the Napa Valley to see Stag's Leap Wine Cellars' new visitor center. This iconic winery was started in 1970, and they've held on to their traditional values through dramatic changes in the region. This new center says a great deal about the evolution of wine tourism globally.
The difference between the old tasting room and the new space is huge. While we enjoyed coming here in the past, the tastings took place in a dark tank room with a few small windows looking out over the courtyard. The new visitor center is modern, stylish, and spacious, with expansive views of the vineyards that give you a true sense of wine country.
The old tasting experience reflected the origins of the winery, when a few growers in the 60s and 70s became convinced that their best grapes would make world-class wines, and people would want to buy them. But once you grow the grapes, you have to make the wine, and then blend it, and then bottle it.
When it came time to select what was going into the bottles, the winemakers would invite family and friends to sit around the table and try the different blends. The ones that got the best scores made it into the bottle.
The wines that didn't score well were shipped out in a tanker truck. But that process was friendly and relaxed, and while most growers didn't think much about the retail experience, that casual feeling carried over into the tasting room.
Tasting rooms were an afterthought, where tasting bars were made from a door sitting on top of a pair of upturned wine barrels. It was a countrified farmer experience that wasn't long on talk. Visitors are still surprised when they realized that wine country is so much farm country. They're used to enjoying their wine in a bar or fancy restaurant. Today, wineries are often destinations designed to attract visitors who will enjoy the wines and remember the brand names.
The famous reputation of Stag's Leap began with a watershed event, the Judgment of Paris, where they won first place for their Cabernet blend. I can't think of another event that created such a dramatic change in the wine world. The competition, held in Paris in 1976, pitted the top American wines against the top French wines in a blind tasting, with all French judges. It didn't seem like a fair fight. The French had been making great wines since the 1700s, and there were thousands of wineries. While the oldest California wineries date back to the mid-1800s, only a small number of important wineries had flashed upon the scene. Most were cheap bulk wines. In 1970, there were only a handful of wineries in Napa and Sonoma, and very few were trying to make world-class wines.
What impresses me is that while the French had their centuries-old traditions that were world-famous standard, the Americans were innovators. Let's try this and let's try that. The lack of a strict tradition encouraged the Americans to experiment. They were, quote, cutting edge when the term hadn't even been coined yet.
The French judges probably had limited experience with American wines. So when they took the covers off the bottles and realized that the top picks were American, they were shocked.
Not only had Stag's Leap been named the best red wine, and Northern Napa's Chateau Montelena named the top white, but American wineries took half the spots in the top 10. It was a rout, and the French, as they say, were très désolés.
The French countered that their wines would age better, but over the years, every time the competition has been repeated, the American wines have still won. Now sometimes it's different American wines, but California terroir has always taken those top spots.
That's because Napa and Sonoma are blessed by their location with a classic Mediterranean climate, sitting just north of a huge bay. We have hot, dry days and cool, humid nights. The sun reflects off the water into the sky above, creating abundant sunshine.
This is especially important early in the morning, when the overnight fog rolls in and the sunlight illuminates those low clouds, producing a richly colored light that makes this area glow. This is amplified in the Stag's Leap district because that cool overnight fog lingers a long time in the canyons and hollows, where the droplets refract the sunlight creating a rainbow of colors.
The quality of the sunlight matters because that's what vines use to make grapes. Those colors become micronutrients. And do you know what we call those? Flavors.
The wines from this area are wonderfully fruity thanks to that morning sunshine. And those western-facing hillsides soak up the afternoon sun, which makes the plants pull sulfur from the soil, producing tannins that help the wines age well.
At the Judgment of Paris, the top white wine was from Chateau Montelena, located in Calistoga at the top of the Napa Valley. That area is a bit hot for good Chardonnay, so they buy Chardonnay grapes from cooler vineyards. By comparison, the award-winning vineyards of Stag's Leap are within sight of the new visitor center.
People often wonder why growers plant so much Cabernet Sauvignon in Napa. It represents more than half the vineyards. That's because they can do it very well. If your land and your climate supports that grape varietal, which Napa does, Cabernet has wonderful advantages. The vines produce more high-quality fruit than other varietals, and its thick skin helps the grapes resist damage from frost, rain, birds, and insects. It's a very popular wine that ages well, so it earns more per ton than other grapes.
Let's remember why we came here, to see the beautiful new visitor center with its great wow factor. We also want to explore why the hospitality here is so good.
I think a big factor is the expansive windows. They allow visitors to taste the wine while looking at the vineyards where the grapes are grown. The windows are aligned, so they're looking up at the Stag's Leap Peak that gives this district its name. For the tasting room team, pouring wine beside the vines makes you feel connected to the process. Winemakers often say, the wine is made in the vineyards. The quality of the land, the sunlight, and the diligence of the farming all contribute to the wine.
The vineyard views give the team a dramatic teaching tool as they describe the complex nature of these vineyards. Those hillsides are iron-rich volcanic rock that are very dynamic, and they instill that quality into the vines. The iron gives the wine muscularity, and there is no wine more muscular than Cabernet. The fractured rocks provide the good drainage that Cabernet Sauvignon likes because, as the farmers say, vines don't like wet feet.
The whole valley is cut by springs, streams, and the Napa River. That creates clay-rich alluvial soils on the valley floor that are perfect for Merlot. The Stag's Leap vineyards have both types of soil thanks to the sloping hillsides and the stream that runs through the middle of the vineyards.
So when you combine Cabernet and Merlot together, you get the depth and muscle of one and the satisfying fruit of the other. Besides those two grapes, the big red wines often include smaller percentages of Cabernet Franc, Malbec, and Petite Verdot. That's why I call winemaking magic, because there is so much that goes into making a really good wine. It starts in the vineyard with the proper management of the vines, and it carries on through the winemaking and blending. But there is that point in time when the winemaker adds that little bit of elfin magic, and the wine becomes more than the sum of its parts.
This is especially true when they're blending the Bordeaux varietals, because they form such a complex interrelationship. That complexity is expressed well in the new hospitality center. The building was planned by the Winarski family before they sold the winery to Chateau Saint-Michel and Marchesi Antinori. One of the reasons that new owners went ahead with the new building was because they needed the production space back.
Their old tasting room doubled as a tank room, and it was zoned for wine making. As demand for the wines increased, they needed the space back. So they told the tasting room, hasta la vista, baby. Fortunately, they had the plans for the new building, and now they pour their wines in sight of their vineyards.
To work in a high-end tasting room, you need to be a good host, a performer, and a salesperson. The process is simple. You welcome the guests, you pour them wine, they drink the wine, and start to relax. Then hopefully, they buy wine to take home with them, because they are going to be thirsty when they get there.
Even if they don't buy wine right then, the next time they look at a restaurant wine list or on a store shelf, their eye is going to linger on the Stag's Leap label and probably lead to a sale. Tasting rooms are important marketing tools because they create relationships.
The floor-to-ceiling windows allow visitors to see the beautiful vineyards as easily as they see the wine. It visually connects the unique qualities of the place to the flavors they're tasting in their glass. It's not just the visitors who are affected. The power of sunlight, vistas, and beauty influences everyone who works there. A beautiful view can be very distracting, but these wines can stand up to that. They are delightful to look at. When you pour them in a glass, it's like pouring liquid jewelry. They're luminous, just like the morning sunlight glowing in those vineyards.
The new hospitality center is located next to an area that was often missed by most people who visited the old tasting room. Their incredible caves. From the old site, the caves were up the hill and behind a building, so they weren't easily accessible. Now that cave complex is next to the tasting room, and it is amazing, with a wow factor of the pendulum room and a great banquet space, which is a showstopper.
Caves are tremendously important for those making wines like Cabernet Sauvignon, which needs to be aged and continues to improve with the years. They offer cool, consistent temperatures, protection from the sunlight, and high humidity. So even though caves are visually interesting and fascinating to visit, they are part of a very practical process.
When we bring large groups to Stag's Leap, it's often the most special part of the day because tasting wine and dining in a cave is so outside of most people's normal experience.
On the wall of the visitor center is an historical timeline. But a visit here is also a timeline. It includes the views of the vineyards with this volcanic geology that creates these wonderful flavors. Next, there is the crush pad and fermentation tanks, and the caves where the wine is sleeping in its barrels.
Then you arrive at this crown jewel of a tasting room where the wine in your glass is illuminated by the same sunlight that created the grapes. The experience helps you appreciate the history of winemaking in the region as you savor the colors and richness of the wine.
Welcome to Wine Country at Work. I'm Ralph de Amicis, and today I have the great pleasure of having my friend Bill Borum, another very seasoned tour guide, here to discuss the video you just saw about Stag's Leap and their evolution. Now, because we're not driving today, we get to have wine.
We do.
So let's have
Yes.
a little bit of a nice...
A very good export pour,
Yes.
which might be more than the 1 ounce that a lot of
That's
people
true.
get.
You don't get enough that way it can swirl properly.
Oh, yes,
You have
that's
to be able to swirl properly.
You have to swirl, that's right.
That's the whole secret with it.
Have you seen some of these new glasses where they have the big dimple in the glass to help with the swirling?
Yeah, I saw that.
I was
Nice. That's
up
very
there, at, I
nice.
think it was Haber family
Paper.
has that. They have special wine glasses.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, there you go.
That's
To your
up
good
there.
health.
Oh, very nice. Now, this is a great lead-in because this is the 40th anniversary of the win at the Judgment of Paris
Yes.
of the Stag's Leap Cabernet Sauvignon.
Yeah,
And I think it was their 72. It was only like the first or second wine they had made.
right.
And of course, Chateau Montelena's Chardonnay. And once again, they had just started, I think, in 1969.
Amazing, yes.
Which, it's remarkable. And what's even more remarkable from our point of view, because we work in the hospitality area, is how much the area has changed. And we were just talking about, because of the El Nino this year, it's going to force a lot of our customers to come later in the year, and it's going to get a little bit busy.
It will be, yeah. Of course, we'll see what will happen in those normal seasonal months of, say, June through October. So we may be quite involved with clients.
And I do notice that we really do have the cycle of the plants. Once bud break takes place, that's when people start really showing up. And then once the last of the grapes are down, it a ghost town again.
Right, it clears out, that's
Everyone
right.
goes to sleep and,
I've been surprised. It seems that we've had an earlier bud break than normal by a few weeks. Is that your impression from driving around?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Especially up in Russian River, they really seem to come in quite early this year. Yeah.
And I wonder if that's a result of the heavier rains. Or I don't know whether people were pruning any earlier, but I think some folks were in a rush kind of to get the pruning over with because they knew the bud break was going to happen.
I think it was part just because of the higher temperature in the soil. We didn't get that many really cold winter days.
That is
we used
true.
to get a lot more cold winter days.
That
here.
is true.
If you could think back to when Narski came here, they were in a very, very different environment in terms of where we were in terms of global warming. It was much, much cooler. They probably had more consistently 80-degree days. We have a fair number that spike over 100 now.
Yes, that is true.
And that's always a challenge. And in the period of time too, the alcohol levels have crept up. When they start making the wines in 72, 73, they were still 12%.
That's right. Yeah, you've had much more ripening and earlier in the cycle too.
Right. Now, both of us go to the big wineries, and both of us go to the very little wineries.
Right.
And of course, one of the interesting evolutions, maybe you can speak to this, because I know you have an extensive background in business too, is the number of wineries that now are in corporate hands that were once family hands. Like Winarski was, I think it's 6-7 years ago that they sold the winery.
Yes, yeah. Well, that is true that some of of course you've got the late 19th century names like Beringer and Charles Krug, although they were, that was under actually the original Krug family rather than Mondavi.
Right.
But I think your point is well taken. Some of the old names have been bought up.
Right. Yeah. But when you look in the Stag's Leap district, change has been very glacial. The land is mostly taken up there. It's not a very big district.
Right.
What is that, a mile long and a half mile wide, I think.
Right.
And all the land is basically owned by the same people who've owned it for years and years.
And then also, you look at, for example, Odette. I sense that they have gotten somehow squeezed more plantings out of the land that was there from the previous family. There's another one.
Yeah.
The Stelzers, right. And so they've made other improvements, the caves there. So I think often the new owners, even if they're kind of corporate, they know what they're doing. They want to increase the traffic.
Right.
But I think the Valley has had a great tradition of wanting to preserve its heritage. And we see this sometimes with the difficulty of having picnics on wineries.
Oh.
People kind of think that, we'll go to a winery, we'll stretch out on the lawn and have a nice picnic. Well, that's not going to happen in most cases.
Well, after 2010, 2011, they were such small harvest years that no one wanted people just coming by and buying a bottle of wine and sitting outside because they had so little wine. And I could swear that most of the picnic tables south of St. Helena disappeared. They were all just gone. You used to be able to go to Ragushi and sit down.
Right.
A number of different places you could eat, comfortably that just disappeared. North of St. Helena, they're still there because traditionally they always have gotten less traffic.
Yes, that's right.
Past the bottleneck there.
But you mentioned another neighbor there of Stag's Leap, and that's Ragushi, which has always been one of my very favorite places, which has become a little bit more of a higher level wine and more reserved, if you want to call it that, in terms of their facility. The beautiful land there, but they've taken away their picnic tables. I saw the last time I drove in there. But that's a beautiful spot, and that, of course, all comes from the Ragushi family of the early 30s who were operating a diversified farming operation there.
Right.
Cattle and other kinds of crops.
Dairy.
And now it's gone over completely to grapes in the last 10 or 15 years. They have beautiful olive trees.
And it's funny because they have all those walnut trees on the way in.
Yes.
But they don't harvest the walnuts at all.
Right. They don't,
Though they do paint the bottom of the walnut trees white.
Right. And that's all ends up to be questions.
Yeah.
Why are they painting the bottom of those trees?
Yeah. And I tell them because they're a working winery and they pick at 2 o'clock in the morning. And when you come up the road at 2 o'clock in the morning, you want to make sure you know where the trees are because when you hit a walnut tree, it doesn't give way.
Hey, now that's a story I have to remember.
Yes. I hope it's correct.
Of course, one of the other features of Ragushi is that they have that wonderful ghost winery there. And that's a great story to tell people about. I think there's probably 10 or 12 of them around the valley with how those have been brought back. And that particular family brought it back and created a beautiful atmosphere.
Oh, it's a really special experience. It's funny too because, you know, the famous Stag's Leap, the one with the apostrophe between the G and the S, the wine cellars, is right next door, and they poured out of a tank room for years. Remember, we would go into the tank room.
That's right.
I always tell people it was like walking into a hardware store. And there were these guys there who looked like they could be in a hardware store, and they had the two things, and they would pour the wine. They would never tell you anything about it. It was like, no, you don't come for the store. You come in to try the wine, right? There were two or three little windows.
Yes.
And they were never clean. Remember that? They were like, it was always
that led to the authenticity maybe, but
that's
anyway.
True. But I think it was just that, you know, they're growers, and selling wine was an afterthought.
Yes.
You know, these growers, they're thinking about next year. They're not thinking about selling wine now. The hospitality people sell them wine.
Yes.
The kids sell them wine. But when they changed over to the other building, it was in part because they wanted the production space back.
Ah, was that right?
That was
I would think so.
It was own commercial, and the wine they were making in that building had gotten so popular, they needed the production space back. And the Winarskis actually had that building designed by the same man who designed the caves. And they had the plans, they just never got around to building it until now. Yeah. And it's a beautiful experience.
It really is. Yeah. And I mean, that terrace area that they have, which is by reservation, you got to do that for sure. Right. But even the stand-up locations, either the counters or the high kind of cabaret tables, those are delightful. All the light in that room.
They're elegant.
As you pointed out, a big difference.
The views of the vineyard.
Really spectacular.
Yeah. And it's funny because you see, usually when you're seeing these really extraordinary buildings, it's not the bigger wineries that are doing them. Usually very wealthy people who are deciding, like, you know, I want to do a great building, like Vineyard 29, for instance.
Yes.
You know, extraordinary building. You know, but it's not that big of a production. What do they do? 4,000 or 5,000 cases a year?
Right.
But the owner was in a position to say, I want to do a great building. Or what's the one on top of Spring Mountain? Is it Vineyard 7 and 8? I think. Or 8, you know, that one.
Right.
You know, incredible location.
Well, that's, I guess, become part of the Napa Valley mystique too. Yeah. Great architecture. Right. I've had clients that have contacted me that said, I want to see great architecture. And sure, he wants the wines to be good too, but to really go to interesting places. One new one that's opened, I'm sure you've been there a number of times, which is Goose Cross.
Oh, yes.
Now there's a transformation. Of course, that's a great story too, where the Coors cousins, I think about 15 of them. So it's this is not a part of the Coors beer empire or beverage empire. It's just the cousins' own investment there. So they paid a lot of attention. And Christy Coors really is very attentive to wanting to make a great success of that one.
It really makes sense in some way. It's a little bit like when Winarski sold it to Chateau Saint Michel and Marchesi Antinori.
Yes.
Well, how many generations have the Antinoris been in the wine? And now his three daughters have come into the business. These really are, even when they're that corporate, many times they're still family businesses. Anyway.
And then there are these, speaking of Goose Cross, right next door there is Cap Shandy, which I mean is really way below the radar.
Oh, yeah.
And that to me, it's another example of someone who's been very successful in another business or profession and has opened up a very limited wine location.
Very expensive wine.
Yeah.
Very expensive.
Right.
I mean, he gets really remarkable scores. You know, it's funny too, you also have other places that are so low-key, some place like Vela. You know, and the main building they've tasted in that little cottage goes, I think, back to the 1920s.
Yes.
But they've preserved that very carefully and encouraged it. And then they've built their cave complex, which is very extensive.
Yes.
And they do their tastings in there. But when you come up to the site, you'd never know.
You'd never know it was there.
That the whole cave complex was there.
Yeah. It's a very homey atmosphere, kind of a rustic hunting lodge almost.
Exactly.
So it's very welcoming to people and great staff.
Yeah. So it's really amazing if you think about when Chateau Montelena and Stag's Leap won, there were 25 wineries, I think, in Napa.
That's right.
And at last count I heard at the beginning of last season, at the beginning of the 2015 season, there were 1,200 bonded wineries and 500 facilities.
Wow.
That's quite a difference.
That is a big difference, right?
You know, and I think I'm sure Sonoma actually has a few more because it's a bigger county.
Yeah. And of course, we're fortunate in that we're happy to take different kinds of people. First-time visitors who know very little, whether they just want to learn something while they're here. Rarely, I think that we've had the booze cruise types of people. Yeah. But even those you can hey, they're out for a good time, so we'll help them.
Well, the reality is that when they've listed the top 10 reasons people come to wine country, wine actually comes in, I think, at 6 or 7.
Oh,
It's not the main reason people come. Part of it's to see wine country, part's the lifestyle, and I think number 3 or 4 is education. Education's a big, big part, and I know you do a lot of that.
right.
And we were chatting about that one day about how, planning the tour out for the people around their interest is part of their educational experience.
Very much
and if
so.
the people aren't going to do that for you, then why are you getting a guide?
Yes, and I think in terms of noticing things, as I drive around, I spend a lot of time talking about the vineyards and the methods of cultivation and what they're seeing and alerting them to look for things. Because most of the time, I think when they go into the wineries, they're hearing about that particular wine that's being poured,
Right.
maybe some aspects of the chemistry. I mean, some of them will do a little bit of a walk around. Maybe there's a tour, formal or informal, involved. But I think it's important to know that half of this is growing the grapes.
Oh, at least half.
And they should notice what's going on there out in the vineyard, where there are cover crops being grown, which we see very full this time of year, what the trellising is all about, which they wouldn't even notice. So they kind of appreciate the outside that they can see and be told about.
I think it's also very interesting, too, that there's a very concerted effort in Napa especially, but it's already present in Sonoma, partially because it's their tradition, to move towards a very green model. They have the Napa green model, which basically means that the winery is mostly powered by alternative methods, usually solar because we get so much sun here,
Right.
that they're not using chemicals, so they may not be certified organic, they're sustainable, and they're avoiding chemicals whenever possible. Someone at Chateau Montelena told me the other day, we go through buckets and buckets of ladybugs because we don't use chemicals, but they put the ladybugs in the vineyards and they go after the nasty bugs. And you see, all the owl houses and
That's right.
stoops for the hawks and such, and they use these natural methods, and that their goal apparently among the vintners is, and by 2020, that the entire county will be Napa green, which would be wonderful because besides the fact that it's safer for the people who live here and work here, including us.
Yes.
And if you walk into a vineyard where they're using a lot of chemicals, you notice it.
Yeah.
If besides that, it makes the wine taste better.
Yeah, it does. More natural, organic, whatever you want to call it. And it's kind of unnerving when you sometimes see the men in spacesuits out there spraying.
Yes.
Which is but we're seeing less of that, fortunately.
Very rarely, very
Right.
rarely anymore, which is fortunate. This year we'll see. I bet there's going to be a lot of spraying sulfur because it's been such a wet winter.
Yes.
But you're right. It's something that makes you raise your eyebrows and say, well, let's go to the next place. Right. Really, you do want to. I find myself steering away from the places which I'm not sure about.
That's right.
And giving preference to the ones that I know are making the commitment.
Yeah.
Because I can taste it. I can smell it in the wine. So I want to thank you, Bill, for taking
Listen, it's been fun to be with you to sample a fine wine, talk about all the things that we see every day, and we're delighted to share with our clients.
How true. That's what I'm telling you.